They were told to never turn with a zero. Every instructor, every manual, every veteran pilot screamed the same warning: don't get into a dogfight with a Japanese zero, you'll die. But when Lieutenant Jimmy "Ace" Patterson pulled his F4F Wildcat into the tightest turn of his life while 3 Zeros closed in for the kill over Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, he wasn't following orders. He was about to discover something that would change American fighter tactics forever and turn the hunters into the hunted. The Japanese Zero was faster, more maneuverable, and could outturn any American fighter by a deadly margin. Their pilots were experienced veterans who had been fighting since 1937. American pilots were dying in alarming numbers, shot down by an enemy aircraft that seemed invincible in aerial combat. But Patterson and a handful of desperate American pilots were about to prove that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when you stop fighting the enemy's fight and start fighting your own. What happened next would revolutionize American air combat, save thousands of Allied lives, and transform the Pacific Air War from a Japanese shooting gallery into an American turkey shoot. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. These accounts reveal how American ingenuity and courage turned certain defeat into decisive victory. The morning sun blazed over the blue waters of the Pacific, turning the ocean into a shimmering mirror that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. High above Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the air was crystal clear and deceptively peaceful. But Lieutenant Jimmy Patterson, 23 years old from Tulsa, Oklahoma, knew that peace was an illusion. Somewhere up there, Japanese fighters were hunting for American aircraft to destroy. Jimmy sat in the cockpit of his F4F Wildcat, part of a 4-plane patrol searching for enemy aircraft reported heading toward Guadalcanal. The Wildcat was a sturdy, reliable fighter, but Jimmy knew its limitations intimately. It was heavier than the Japanese Zero, less maneuverable, and slower in a climb. Every American pilot had been drilled with the same message: avoid turning fights with Zeros at all costs. The radio crackled in Jimmy's headset. Bandits, 10 o'clock high, coming down fast. The voice belonged to his wingman, Lieutenant Bob "Crash" Morrison from Detroit. Jimmy looked up and to his left, squinting against the glare of the tropical sun. Then he saw them, 3 dark specks diving out of the sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. Zeros. The most feared fighter aircraft in the Pacific. Jimmy's throat tightened as he recognized the distinctive silhouette of the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter. Lightweight, agile, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience, the Zero had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. American pilots called it the Zeke, but most had another name for it, the Widowmaker. The lead Zero opened fire at 400 yards, its twin 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns sending streams of bullets and shells toward Jimmy's Wildcat. Jimmy broke hard right, his aircraft shuddering under the G-forces as he tried to avoid the enemy fire. But the Zero pilot anticipated the move, turning with Jimmy and closing the distance rapidly. Every instinct told Jimmy to dive away, to use his aircraft's superior diving speed to escape. That was standard doctrine. Wildcats didn't dogfight with Zeros. They hit and ran, using superior firepower and diving speed to engage on their terms. But something made Jimmy hesitate. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was desperation, maybe it was the sight of his wingman already under attack by the other 2 Zeros. Instead of diving away, Jimmy did something that every manual said was suicide. He pulled his Wildcat into the tightest possible turn, trying to outturn a Zero at its own game. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. The mathematical advantage that killed Americans. The numbers were brutal and undeniable. The Mitsubishi A6M0 weighed 5,313 pounds empty and could complete a 360-degree turn in just 16 seconds at combat speed. The Grumman F4F Wildcat weighed 7,952 pounds empty and required 19 seconds for the same maneuver. Those 3 seconds of difference meant life or death in aerial combat. The Zero's advantage went beyond just turning ability. It could climb at 3,100 feet per minute compared to the Wildcat's 2,265 feet per minute. It had a service ceiling of 33,000 feet versus the Wildcat's 28,800 feet. In almost every category that mattered for dogfighting, the Zero was superior. Japanese pilots exploited these advantages ruthlessly. They would engage American fighters in turning combat, where their superior maneuverability allowed them to quickly gain advantageous firing positions. American pilots who tried to turn with Zeros found themselves quickly outmaneuvered and shot down. Lieutenant Commander John "Jimmy" Thatch, the Navy's leading tactical expert, had been studying Zero performance since early 1942. His analysis was sobering. American fighters could not compete with Zeros in traditional dogfighting scenarios. The technological gap was simply too large to overcome through pilot skill alone. But Thatch and pilots like Jimmy Patterson were beginning to suspect that the Zero's advantages came with hidden costs. The aircraft's light weight and extreme maneuverability were achieved by sacrificing armor protection and structural strength. A Zero could outturn any American fighter, but it was also more vulnerable to battle damage. More importantly, Japanese pilots had become overconfident in their aircraft's superiority. They expected American fighters to flee from turning engagements, and they had developed predictable attack patterns based on that expectation. Jimmy Patterson was about to discover that sometimes predictability could be exploited, even by an inferior aircraft flown by a pilot willing to take extraordinary risks. The impossible turn that changed everything. As Jimmy hauled his Wildcat around in the tightest turn he could manage, pulling G-forces that made his vision blur and his body feel like it weighed 1,000 pounds, he watched the Zero pilot's reaction with desperate attention. The Japanese pilot, expecting the American to dive away or attempt to escape, had positioned himself for a standard pursuit curve that would bring him into a perfect firing position as the Wildcat fled. But Jimmy wasn't fleeing. He was turning into the attack, accepting the dogfight that every manual said he couldn't win. The Zero pilot realized what was happening and tightened his own turn, trying to bring his guns to bear on the Wildcat. For several seconds, both aircraft flew in tight circles, each pilot trying to gain an advantage in the deadly dance of aerial combat. Jimmy could see the Zero's pilot clearly now, less than 200 yards away, both aircraft turning so tightly they were almost stalling. Then Jimmy noticed something that changed everything. The Zero, flying at the absolute edge of its performance envelope, was shuddering. Its control surfaces were fluttering as the aircraft approached a high-speed stall. The Japanese pilot, focused entirely on outturning the Wildcat, was pushing his aircraft beyond its safe operating limits. Jimmy had discovered the Zero's hidden weakness. While it could outturn any American fighter under normal circumstances, it became unstable and vulnerable when pushed to its absolute limits. The same lightweight and flexible construction that gave it superior maneuverability also made it prone to structural stress and control problems under extreme G-forces. More importantly, Japanese pilots had become so accustomed to easy victories that they weren't prepared for American pilots willing to engage in suicidal turning fights. They expected their enemies to follow doctrine, not to improvise desperate tactics that violated every rule of aerial combat. Jimmy held his turn for another few seconds, watching the Zero pilot struggle with his increasingly unstable aircraft. Then, at exactly the right moment, Jimmy rolled out of his turn and dove slightly, bringing his 6.50 caliber machine guns to bear on the Zero's thin aluminum skin. The burst lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was devastating. The Zero's unarmored fuel tanks exploded in a ball of orange flame, and the graceful fighter that had seemed invincible moments before tumbled toward the ocean as a burning wreck. Jimmy had just proved that American fighters could outturn Zeros, if they were willing to risk everything on a single desperate maneuver. The spread of desperate wisdom. Word of Jimmy Patterson's successful turning engagement with a Zero spread through American fighter squadrons like wildfire. Other pilots began experimenting with similar tactics, trying to understand exactly what Patterson had done and whether it could be repeated reliably. Lieutenant Bob Morrison, Patterson's wingman who had witnessed the entire engagement, became one of the first to successfully replicate the technique. During a dogfight over Henderson Field 3 days after Patterson's victory, Morrison found himself in a turning fight with a Zero that should have been hopeless. But Morrison had learned from watching Patterson. Instead of trying to sustain a long turning battle, he pulled his Wildcat into the tightest possible turn for just a few seconds, forcing the Zero pilot to push his aircraft to its structural limits. When the Japanese fighter began to shudder and lose control, Morrison rolled out and attacked, shooting down his second Zero in less than a week. The key insight was timing. American pilots couldn't sustain turning fights with Zeros, but they could survive brief turning engagements if they understood exactly when to break off and attack. The technique required split-second timing, perfect understanding of both aircraft's performance characteristics, and the courage to bet everything on a few seconds of desperate maneuvering. Major John Smith, commanding officer of VMF 223, the Marine Fighter Squadron based at Henderson Field, began organizing informal training sessions where experienced pilots shared their techniques with new arrivals. These sessions revealed that several pilots had independently discovered variations of Patterson's technique. Lieutenant Tom "Lucky" Johnson had found that Zeros became vulnerable when forced to turn while climbing at high altitude, where the thin air reduced their maneuverability advantage. Captain Mike "Hawk" Williams discovered that Zeros lost stability when turning while carrying external fuel tanks, making them easy targets for quick burst attacks. The common thread was that American pilots were learning to exploit the Zero's weaknesses rather than simply avoiding its strengths. They were developing tactics that turned the Zero's advantages into liabilities by forcing Japanese pilots to operate their aircraft beyond safe limits. But the most important discovery was psychological. American pilots who had been terrified of engaging Zeros in turning combat were regaining confidence and fighting effectiveness. They were learning that their supposedly inferior aircraft could compete successfully if flown with intelligence, courage, and perfect timing. The boom and zoom evolution. As American pilots became more comfortable with brief turning engagements, they began developing increasingly sophisticated tactics that combined turning ability with their aircraft's traditional advantages in firepower and diving speed. Jimmy Patterson pioneered what became known as the boom and zoom technique. The tactic began with a high-altitude approach, using the Wildcat's superior diving characteristics to build up speed before engaging the enemy. Patterson would dive on a formation of Zeros from above and behind, using his aircraft's superior firepower to damage or destroy one enemy fighter in a high-speed attack. But instead of trying to escape immediately, he would pull into a brief turning fight with the surviving Zeros. The key was that Patterson entered the turning engagement with significant energy advantages, higher speed and better positioning, that partially offset the Zero's superior maneuverability. For a few crucial seconds, he could match the Zero's turning performance while maintaining the option to dive away if the situation became untenable. The technique required extraordinary skill and judgment. Pilots had to assess multiple variables simultaneously: their own aircraft's energy state, the enemy's position and speed, the altitude and terrain, and the exact moment when their brief turning advantage would disappear. A mistake in timing or judgment usually meant death. Captain Robert "Iron" Murphy became the leading practitioner of boom and zoom tactics, developing variations that allowed American pilots to engage multiple Zeros simultaneously. Murphy's technique involved diving attacks that separated Zero formations, then brief turning engagements with individual aircraft that had been isolated from their wingmen. "The secret is never trying to sustain a dogfight," Murphy explained to newly arrived pilots. "You turn with them just long enough to get a good shot, then you get out before they can use their maneuverability advantage. It's like boxing with a faster opponent, you land your punch and get away before he can counterpunch." The psychological effect on Japanese pilots was significant. They found themselves facing American fighters that refused to follow expected patterns of behavior. Instead of fleeing from turning engagements, Wildcats would suddenly reverse direction and attack with aggressive turning maneuvers that seemed impossible for such heavy aircraft. Zero pilots, accustomed to easy victories against retreating American fighters, found themselves dealing with opponents who fought back with techniques that Japanese training had never addressed. The systematic revolution in aerial combat. By October 1942, the success of Patterson's turning tactics had attracted the attention of Navy and Marine Corps leadership. Commander John Thatch, the Navy's leading fighter tactician, arrived at Guadalcanal to observe and document the new techniques being developed by frontline pilots. Thatch spent 2 weeks flying combat missions with VMF 223, participating in dogfights and recording detailed observations of how the new tactics worked in practice. His reports to Pacific Fleet headquarters emphasized that American pilots had solved problems that conventional doctrine had failed to address. Lieutenant Patterson and his fellow pilots have discovered that technological inferiority can be overcome through tactical innovation, Thatch wrote. By refusing to accept the limitations imposed by their aircraft's performance characteristics, they have developed techniques that allow American fighters to compete successfully against superior enemy aircraft. The Navy moved quickly to incorporate the new tactics into official training programs. Patterson was temporarily assigned to the Fighter Training Unit at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where he helped develop curricula that emphasized aggressive turning tactics and precise timing in aerial engagements. The training programs stressed several principles that departed significantly from pre-war fighter doctrine. First, that technological disadvantages could be overcome through tactical innovation and superior pilot training. American fighters might not be able to match Zeros in sustained dogfights, but they could win brief turning engagements with proper technique and timing. Second, that aggressive tactics often proved more effective than defensive ones. Pilots who engaged Zeros directly, even in disadvantageous circumstances, often achieved better results than those who tried to avoid combat entirely. Third, that individual pilot skill was more important than aircraft performance. A skilled pilot in an inferior aircraft could defeat a mediocre pilot in a superior aircraft, provided the skilled pilot understood exactly how to exploit his opponent's weaknesses. Fourth, that innovation and adaptation were crucial for success. Pilots who continued to use outdated tactics against an evolving enemy would be defeated, regardless of their aircraft's capabilities. The systematic implementation of these principles transformed American fighter effectiveness in the Pacific. Wildcat pilots who had been suffering heavy casualties in conventional engagements began achieving favorable kill ratios against superior Japanese aircraft. The battle of tactical innovation over Rabaul. The ultimate test of Patterson's tactical innovations came during a major air battle over the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul in November 1942. Japanese forces had concentrated over 200 aircraft at Rabaul, including their best pilots and most advanced fighters. American intelligence indicated that the Japanese were planning a major offensive against Allied positions in the Solomon Islands. The American response was a series of long-range bombing attacks against Rabaul, escorted by Wildcat fighters using the new turning tactics that Patterson had pioneered. The missions would require American fighters to engage large numbers of Zeros over enemy territory, far from friendly bases and support. Patterson's squadron was assigned to escort a formation of B-25 bombers attacking shipping in Rabaul Harbor. The mission profile was extremely dangerous, a 400-mile flight over enemy territory, followed by combat with numerically superior Japanese fighters, then the long flight home with limited fuel reserves. The Japanese response was massive. Over 60 Zero fighters rose to intercept the American formation, led by some of Japan's most experienced pilots. The ensuing air battle would test every aspect of the new American fighting techniques. Patterson led his 8-plane fighter escort in a series of diving attacks on the Zero formations, using boom and zoom tactics to break up the enemy's numerical advantage. But instead of trying to escape after each attack, the American pilots engaged in brief turning fights with isolated Zeros, using the techniques Patterson had developed over Guadalcanal. The battle lasted for nearly 30 minutes, with aircraft scattered across miles of sky above Rabaul. American pilots found themselves in exactly the kind of sustained dogfighting that conventional doctrine said they should avoid. But the new tactics proved devastatingly effective. By using brief turning engagements to gain advantageous firing positions, then diving away before the Zeros could exploit their maneuverability, American pilots achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible. Patterson's squadron shot down 12 Japanese fighters while losing only 2 Wildcats. More importantly, the escort mission was successful. The B-25 bombers completed their attack on Rabaul Harbor, sinking 3 Japanese transport ships and damaging port facilities. The Japanese offensive that the bombing was designed to prevent never materialized. The success over Rabaul demonstrated that turning tactics could be scaled up from individual dogfights to large-scale air battles. Patterson's innovations had evolved from desperate improvisation into systematic doctrine that could be applied across the entire Pacific theater. The transformation of American air power. The impact of Patterson's tactical innovations extended throughout American fighter units in the Pacific. By early 1943, Wildcat pilots across the theater were applying variations of turning tactics, fundamentally changing the character of air combat against Japanese forces. The transformation was particularly evident in casualty statistics. American fighter losses, which had been catastrophically high during the first year of Pacific fighting, dropped significantly as pilots learned to engage Zeros aggressively rather than simply trying to avoid them. Japanese pilots, accustomed to the technological superiority that had characterized the early war period, found themselves increasingly frustrated by American fighters that refused to fight conventional engagements. Zero pilots who had dominated earlier aerial battles found themselves outmaneuvered by supposedly inferior American aircraft. The psychological impact was significant. Japanese fighter pilots who had entered combat with supreme confidence in their aircraft and training found themselves dealing with American pilots who used unpredictable tactics and achieved unexpected results. American pilot morale improved dramatically as word spread that Zeros could be defeated in turning combat. Pilots who had dreaded encounters with Japanese fighters began actively seeking aerial combat, confident that their new techniques gave them competitive advantages despite their aircraft's limitations. But the transformation went beyond individual battles. Patterson's techniques influenced American fighter development for the remainder of the war. While the Wildcat remained the primary Navy and Marine fighter through 1943, subsequent aircraft designs emphasized the speed and firepower characteristics that made boom and zoom tactics possible. The F4F Hellcat, which began replacing Wildcats in late 1943, incorporated lessons learned from turning tactics development. The Hellcat was designed to be fast enough to choose when to engage Zeros, powerful enough to inflict decisive damage in brief encounters, and rugged enough to survive the structural stresses of high-G turning combat. Most importantly, Patterson had demonstrated that tactical innovation could overcome technological disadvantages when applied by skilled, aggressive pilots willing to take calculated risks. The human cost and the human triumph. Behind the statistics of Patterson's tactical revolution were human stories of survival, adaptation, and professional growth. Fighter pilots who had expected to die in their first encounters with Zeros instead learned techniques that allowed them to compete successfully and survive the war. Lieutenant Bob Morrison, Patterson's wingman during that first turning engagement over Guadalcanal, credited the new tactics with saving his life on multiple occasions. Before Jimmy figured out how to turn with Zeros, we were just running away and hoping they wouldn't catch us, Morrison later recalled. After we learned how to fight them on our terms, we became the hunters instead of the hunted. The transformation was psychological as much as tactical. American pilots who had felt helpless against Japanese technological superiority regained confidence and fighting effectiveness when they learned techniques that allowed them to compete successfully. The technique spread throughout the Pacific theater through letters, unit transfers, and informal communication networks. Pilots shared their experiences and innovations, creating a constantly evolving body of tactical knowledge that improved American fighter effectiveness throughout the war. Patterson himself was promoted to captain and eventually assigned to develop advanced fighter tactics for newly arriving squadrons. His emphasis on aggressive turning combat, precise timing, and exploiting enemy weaknesses influenced thousands of American pilots throughout the Pacific campaign. But Patterson never forgot that his innovations had emerged from desperation rather than inspiration. "We didn't get clever because we wanted to," he later explained. "We got clever because the alternative was getting killed." When your life depends on finding a solution, you find solutions that nobody thought were possible. The human dimension of tactical innovation was crucial to its success. Patterson's techniques worked not because they were theoretically superior, but because they matched the capabilities and personalities of American pilots fighting with American equipment under Pacific combat conditions. The success of turning tactics demonstrated that effective military innovation often comes from frontline troops who understand their equipment and their enemy better than distant planners or doctrine writers. Patterson and his fellow pilots had solved problems that conventional military wisdom had failed to address. The legacy of desperate innovation. As the Pacific War continued through 1943 and 1944, the principles Patterson had developed continued to influence American fighter tactics. The aggressive turning techniques he had pioneered with Wildcats proved adaptable to newer aircraft and different combat situations. The arrival of the F4F Wildcat and F4U Corsair gave American pilots aircraft that could match or exceed zero performance in most categories. But the tactical principles Patterson had established, using brief turning engagements to gain firing opportunities, exploiting enemy overconfidence, and fighting aggressively rather than defensively, remained central to American fighter doctrine. Korean War pilots facing Soviet MiG-15 fighters used modified versions of Patterson's techniques to achieve success despite significant performance disadvantages. The emphasis on tactical innovation and aggressive combat that Patterson had developed proved adaptable to jet aircraft and different enemies. But perhaps Patterson's most important legacy was the demonstration that technological inferiority could be overcome through pilot skill, tactical innovation, and the courage to attempt techniques that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. Patterson completed his combat tour in early 1944, having been credited with 14 confirmed victories against Japanese aircraft. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his tactical innovations and his role in developing the turning combat techniques that transformed American fighter effectiveness. He returned to the United States to train newly commissioned pilots in the tactics he had pioneered, ensuring that his innovations would continue to save American lives throughout the remainder of the war. The fighter training unit at Pensacola became the center for developing and refining the aggressive turning tactics that Patterson had discovered over Guadalcanal. The techniques he developed influenced not only individual pilots but entire squadrons and air groups. The principles of boom and zoom combat, aggressive turning engagements, and exploiting enemy predictability became standard elements of American fighter training. Most importantly, Patterson had shown that innovation and adaptation were more important than technological superiority in determining the outcome of aerial combat. His legacy was a reminder that the most important military advantages often come from human factors: skill, courage, creativity, and the willingness to challenge conventional assumptions, rather than simply from superior equipment. The enduring lesson of aerial adaptation. The broader significance of Patterson's story extends beyond fighter tactics to fundamental questions about innovation, adaptation, and success under pressure. Patterson had demonstrated that predetermined disadvantages could be overcome when intelligent, skilled individuals were willing to reject conventional approaches and develop new solutions. This principle proved relevant not only to military aviation but to competitive situations in many fields. The key insight was that competitors often fail not because they lack capabilities, but because they accept limitations that more innovative opponents refuse to acknowledge. Patterson's approach required a particular kind of intellectual courage, the willingness to attempt techniques that experts said were impossible, based on personal observation and practical experience rather than theoretical analysis. He had been willing to risk everything on tactics that violated established doctrine because he understood that conventional approaches weren't working. This kind of adaptive thinking became increasingly important as technological and competitive environments accelerated. The principles Patterson had pioneered, rapid innovation, tactical flexibility, and the courage to challenge expert opinion, proved essential for success in rapidly changing competitive situations. Patterson's legacy was also a reminder that innovation often comes from practitioners rather than theorists, from people solving immediate problems rather than experts developing abstract solutions. His techniques emerged from battlefield necessity, not academic study, and their effectiveness was proven through combat results rather than theoretical analysis. Most importantly, Patterson's story demonstrated that ordinary people with specialized knowledge and practical experience could solve problems that conventional wisdom considered unsolvable. His background as a civilian pilot from Oklahoma, not an academy graduate or military theorist, emphasized that innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The techniques Patterson developed continued to influence American military aviation long after World War II ended. The principles of aggressive engagement, tactical flexibility, and exploiting enemy weaknesses that he had pioneered remained relevant as aircraft technology evolved and new enemies emerged. But the broader lesson transcended military applications. Patterson had shown that success often depends more on how existing capabilities are used than on the raw specifications of those capabilities. Superior equipment means nothing if it's used predictably, while inferior equipment can achieve decisive results when used innovatively. So here's the question Patterson's story poses: in your own challenges, what conventional wisdom are you accepting that might be wrong? What advantages do you have that you're not exploiting because experts say they're insufficient? And do you have the courage to attempt solutions that everyone else says are impossible, based on your own understanding of what actually works? Jimmy Patterson proved that sometimes the most important victories come not from having better equipment, but from using whatever equipment you have in ways that nobody expects. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible when you stop accepting other people's definitions of what can and cannot be done.